Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker. Ellen is the Transition Projects Director and the Montana Deafblind Project Director at the University of Montana's Rural Institute on Disabilities, where she has worked since 1996 on transition and employment for youth with significant disabilities. She is also a consultant with Mark Golden Association and Associates and works part-time for the National Center on Deafblindness. Ellen has worked in the field of developmental disabilities since 1986. Prior to coming to Montana, her experiences included hands-on service delivery, program development, and program management in community, residential, and supported employment programs. Ellen received her master's degree in special education from Boston College in 1990 after completing coursework in transition and supported employment. At the Rural Institute, she has served as the principal investigator and project director for numerous federal and state-funded grants. She has also provided technical assistance, training, and on-site support to schools, agencies, and individuals and families, predominantly in the area of customized employment, transition, and systematic instruction. It is my pleasure to welcome today Ellen Condon. Thank you, Ellen, for being with us, and I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And basically what we're talking about is transition from school to a full adult life. And we're talking about students with complex needs. So those students who frequently, we're not really sure what they're going to do after school. They're hard to figure out what they like and don't like sometimes. And we're not really sure what the possibilities are. And so from Susan's kind of reading of my bio, basically this is the population that I've worked with for most of my career. And these are the students that I call the interesting students. And now through my work with the National Center on Deafblindness, the students I get to talk about or think about how to do transition planning for get even more interesting, because now we have a dual sensory loss on top of additional disabilities. But as we're thinking about transition, we need to think about these are the students who also will have long-term support needs. So in school, these students frequently have one-to-one supports or interveners. And so how does that transition as we think about what their day is going to look like when they no longer come to school? That's a huge part of transition planning for students with complex needs. And, as we're thinking transition, what I want to talk about is, where are students going to live? Who are they going to live with? What are they going to do for fun? Are they going to be members of their community? Are they going to work? And so transition planning gets pretty complex for this population. And so when we look first at what the law says around what we need to do in terms of what schools need to do for transition planning, basically the IEP team needs to start talking about transition when a student is 16, or the IEP in which that student's going to turn 16, or earlier if that team deems appropriate. I know in both Wyoming and Montana, legally, we don't start until 16. We still follow this federal law. So in Wyoming, that gives you maybe 5 years to talk about what somebody's adult life is going to look like and how you're going to get them from point A to point B. The other piece that schools are taxed with is determining what those post-secondary goals are. So, where's the person going to live? What are they going to do for employment or education? What are they going to do for further training? And are there independent living goals? And those goals are based on age-appropriate transition assessments. And in working with schools, I think schools really are challenged by how do we assess students who don't have reliable means of communication or formal means of communication, who we're not sure what they like and don't like or what they can do. And I guess part of what I want to share with you today are different stories and different possibilities to say, let's raise our expectations of what people with a significant impact of disability can do and how we can support families to get a rich, full life for their adult child with a disability. And how do we figure out what students' strengths and preferences and interests are, even when these are students who don't have a formal communication system? So I think one of the huge challenges is, when do we start thinking about what life after school is going to look like? So for those of you who have children, think about, when did you start talking to them about what their adult life was going to look like? Or for any of us who could remember, like, when did we start thinking about, are we going to have a job as an adult? What's it going to be? And, I don't know how old I was when I started thinking, well, of course I'm going to get a job, but I knew what I wanted to buy early on. I knew that I needed money. I presumed I was going to have a job. It wasn't something that I started thinking about when I was 16. It was something that my family just presumed was going to happen for me and my sister and the grandkids. So when we think about starting transition planning for somebody who's got a significant impact of disability, we really need to start a whole lot earlier talking to families. And we really need to allow families to really think of the possibility of a future of their child possibly owning their own home, owning their own business, or working for somebody else. And it's got to start long before age 16. And I think for families, they're probably relying on us professionals to let them know what the options are for their young adults. And so for teachers, getting to know what the possibilities could be for rich adult lives, I think is something that we really need to commit to. And so, thinking about not starting at 16, but thinking about, let's have this conversation about a child with a significant impact of disability going to work or owning their own business. And let's start it real early. And let's infuse that philosophy throughout day-to-day activities. So is there a career day in elementary school? Is it that every child participates in that career day and career fair? Are we showcasing business owners and employees who have significant impacts of disability? We need to make this a culture, because it's way too hard to start thinking about employment and connecting to the long-term supports to support that employment starting at age 16. So, and think about, like, families probably, like, I don't have children, but if I had a child with a disability, I would guess that some of the earliest information I'm going to get about my child's future isn't going to be real positive. Thinking back to what I've heard from families, they aren't highly encouraged when their child is first diagnosed with an ongoing disability. They may be hearing that, don't get your expectations up. Your child's going to need support for the rest of their life and care. That may be true. I've worked with a lot of families who have children with ongoing support needs, but that doesn't mean that their children can't be community members, that the family can't have high expectations for what that child can do as an adult, even though they do have ongoing support needs. But families and support staff really need examples of what that can look like and what's possible versus just what exists in our communities. the other tricky part about transition planning is figuring out if your support has been provided by the school and children's services until this child turns 18 or 21 when they exit your school system. How do we connect families to long-term supports and services that are your formal services, such as voc rehab, developmental disabilities, mental health services? And then also, how do we help families think about if there's wait lists for those services? What are some informal ways to support their son or daughter to still have a rich, full life? And so as we're thinking about transition planning, and I think one tool that I've seen some high schools use on the first day of high school, or as students are transitioning from middle to high school, is actually printing out some blank daytimer pages and talking to a family about, okay, so your child is starting high school. We've got 4 years to plan for their adult life. And so what we'd like you to think about is, okay, so when they no longer come to school, what's going to fill up this day timer? Where are they going to go during the day? Who's going to support them? What are they going to do for fun? Who are they going to connect with and do social things with? Are they going to be working? What's that going to look like? Where are they going to live? Who are they going to live with? What kind of support needs do they have to live in the place of their choice? And parents are really relying on schools to help think about what's possible and how to get there. And this research, I became aware of this recently, but just the importance of the parent expectations around what their adult child's going to do. And so parent expectations have been found to be more influential on whether or not a child with a significant impact of disability will work in the community after high school graduation than even the quality of transition services. It's a pretty powerful statement or finding. So I think it really emphasizes the fact that even though IDEA and the law around transition really it dictates what schools need to do, I think we really need to make sure that we're engaging families and empowering families and informing families, because also families they're going to be the ones holding the bag and figuring out the supports and coordinating supports when somebody exits school, but also their expectations and their ideas for their child's adult future is really going to help make or break what that looks like. And this is more findings from Carter in the 2014 paper. But the most powerful force in changing transition outcomes for young people with significant disabilities is inspiration and expectation of individuals' parents. And young adults with significant disabilities, whose parents definitely expected them to obtain paid work, were 5 times more likely to have a paid community employment 2 years post-high school exit. Again, that's pretty profound. And so I want to share with you this story of a young woman that I got the honor of working with in Missoula years ago. And she and her mom came to meet me, and it was the week before she started high school. And the mom said, I heard that you might be able to help us think about transition. You know, Natalia's just starting high school. We don't have a clue what to do. And so what I ended up doing was sitting down at their kitchen table with them and just talking about, well, what do you think Natalia's adult life is going to look like after she doesn't go to high school anymore? Like, where's she going to live? Is she going to have a job in the community? Is she going to be married? And I think the last question really set mom back and was like, whoa, I don't even want to go there yet. And so she's like, I have no idea. And I said, well, you really want to think about where you're headed what would make Natalia happy, what she'd like, so that you can use these 4 years wisely to think about what kind of skills and education and experiences will help prepare her to get from where she is now to there. And Mom was obviously looking pretty overwhelmed. This is the first day of high school. She's taken the bus to school. They haven't started talking about transition planning at the IEP yet. And so just to help Mom think about the conversation, it's like, well, tell me who your daughter is. And I am, I don't mean to say that I wasn't asking Natalia, but when I would ask Natalia a question, she would look down at the table or her feet, and I couldn't get an answer. And so she was at the table with us. And so her mom showed me this list, and it was basically Natalia's to-do list, and it was written in pencil, and it was sitting on the kitchen table. And so I started asking questions about that. And I did dawn on me initially that she had written it and that it was her list, and she chose to write the list. And as I'm just hearing about her routine and how the morning goes and how the day goes when she comes home from school, I realized that this is a young woman who's got a very packed life. On her to-do list is practice the violin, go to swim practice, make pot holders, and it goes on and on. And so I ask more about the list, and her mom says she likes to write the list, and if it changes, she will erase it and edit it. But she likes to know what's next, and I'm asking about violin practice, swimming, and oh yeah, like that's, this is, she's the youngest of 3 children, and everybody's been physically active. They've all been musical. They've all been severely academic. And that's this family's values. And this is the same life for Natalia as well. And so as I learn a little more about her, basically she tells me that she's totally independent in the morning as long as nobody disrupts her routine. And as I ask again about like, what do you think some goals would be for after she graduates high school? Mom looks at me and she's looking already tired. And she says, if I can get her to get up and get out of the house and out to that school bus on her own without me nagging her every 5 minutes, that's going to be a huge success by the end of the 4 years. And so as I've learned about her, and maybe this hour and a half I sat at the table with them, what I heard from Mom was that this is a young woman who's got some significant skills. As long as nobody gets in her way, she follows the routine, and it's at her pace, and it gets done because she likes making sure that everything on the list is done. And so we started talking about what are some other strategies to help her manage her time. Because I said, well, Jan, how's it going with you nagging at her? She's like, not very well. We're both a little crabby by the time the bus comes. So we looked at, okay, so if one of the goals is for her to do things on her own within a specific time frame, and I'm thinking this is a great skill for work, this is a great skill for getting ready for a date or meeting friends for dinner. This is a great adult life skill. So we started talking about using some strategies about how do you give her information about how much more time she has. So within a month, Natalia is getting up and out the door for school on her own, and Jan's in the basement doing yoga. And we're like, great, let's start talking about cool stuff now. Like, what are we going to do for work? So we started talking about, what are her interests? How will she get to work? So throughout the 4 years, we came up with different work experiences for her. Mom figured them out with school. She started riding the bus on her own. And Natalia will answer questions as long as you phrase them in the right way. Or if you write them down and give her a fill in the blank, she'll tell you the answer. So you have to be pretty familiar with what her topics are and how she speaks to be able to communicate verbally with her. But once you get to know her, you realize the skills, the interests, the motivation, and she's quite self-determined. So as we were trying to figure out what the first work experience was, during that first day at the kitchen table, her mom said, well, Natalia, tell Ellen where you went on the bus this summer. And so at first she says, I went to Big Sky High School. And her mom says, no, not today. Where'd you go on the bus this summer? And all of a sudden she realizes what they're talking about. She goes, oh, Missoula Children's Theater. And I was like, oh, great. Did you go see a play? She's like, yes. I'm like, were you in the play? Yes. And so I look at her mother and she goes, Natalia, tell Ellen, what were you in the play? And so she tells me that she's a forest creature. And I was like, wow. And I'm thinking, okay, so did you have lines? And her mom said, oh yeah, she has lines in the play. And I'm like, okay, I'm pretty optimistic in this conversation, but I'm trying to figure out, okay, I'm like, okay, tell me what that looked like, because I'm not getting it. And her mom says, as long as she has a script, she memorizes it, and she just needs work on amplification. But oh yeah, she has lines in the play. And I'm thinking, wow, okay. So this was a great tool for getting to know who this young person was, sitting at their table, interviewing the mom, looking for clues about who she was. Had I had the same conversation probably in the high school, I probably wouldn't have gotten this information. But this mom had a ton of information that would impact transition planning and help us figure out how to support this young woman to be employed, to live independently, to have a rich, full life. But I had to really empower this mom to help her think that her information was valuable, and also to help her really think about where that information would lead her and her daughter. And so this is another young woman. I think I'm going to introduce you to 3 students that I've had the opportunity, who are all, they're all old now, which makes me a whole lot older. But they're all, this young woman's in her mid-30s now. And so as I started working with this school, it was really the staff who needed help thinking outside of the box and thinking really optimistically about what students with significant impacts of disability, what their lives could look like after they graduated high school. Because when I first asked the teacher, where do you see, this was a classroom with 3 students with pretty significant impacts of disability. It was a segregated classroom in a small rural school. The students spent all day in the classroom. They didn't even go to lunch with the other students. And so when I asked, where do you see Carly after she leaves high school? The teacher very innocently responded, well, I assume she'll go to that building down the hill where all the other people who use wheelchairs go. I was like, hey, did you ever think about work? Could we think about employment? Sure, help us figure it out. And so in this picture, basically it's the paraprofessional Annie who's holding up a poster that she has putting together the photos based on what Carly wants, as we're thinking about what do you want when you graduate? Carly's got some pretty distinct ideas. In the middle is a picture of Carly, and she's seated in a new wheelchair, a new power chair. And this power chair rises and lowers. And that's part of her dream for her, what her adult life is going to look like. And there's a picture of a Delta talker or communication device. She wants a new communication device that helps her come up with what she wants to say, and gives her all those opportunities. In the top left-hand corner of this sheet is a picture of her in front of an apartment building. There's also pictures of CDs and music and friends so that she can be talking with friends. And then also a shopping cart in the lower left-hand corner. And, Carly's pictured in the right-hand side of this picture with a big smile on her face. And so as we really started thinking about what the possibilities were for Carly, her family always assumed she was going to be part of the community. It was the school that didn't have very high expectations just because they didn't know what was possible or what could happen. And so this classroom was part of a pilot project that we did around transition. And so we got to work with them for a couple years to think about what are the possibilities. And Carly was raised by a single mom who had to figure out, how do I support Carly to be independent, because I have to work and support 3 kids. And so they figured out how Carly would direct her own personal care staff when mom worked nights, and that personal care staff had to show up and get Carly ready for bed, because Carly requires full personal care to get into bed, to get ready for bed. And on nights when the personal care attendant didn't show up, Carly figured out how to get help. She actually called her teacher. She used her communication device to communicate, "Bed now, help please." And Don figured it out. He drove down to her small community, drove down to her house, figured out what was going on, figured out that the person who was on staff that night didn't show up, and so helped Carly. So what, for that family, it was really figuring out, how do we help them think about employment and community living and empower them to communicate what they knew about Carly and how she got her needs met so that she could live independently. And so with this slide, the question is, where do people with significant support needs live after they graduate high school? At the bottom of the list, it says, our more traditional options, like a group home that's staffed and you live with other people with disabilities, or maybe you live in a host home, so a family that provides support for funding, or supported living, you're in your own apartment with support. But the other options might be that you live in your own home. For folks who qualify for HUD or low-income housing, those payments can be used to pay a mortgage. And so I've known several adults with ongoing support needs who rely on personal care attendants to get them in and out of bed, to get them, up and started for the day. They own their home. They own their own homes. Some people live with friends or roommates and they barter rent for support or assistance. And some families have figured out, like, building an in-law apartment or an apartment over the garage, or, in rural Montana, we have families who have, maybe they moved out of the house and into another house on the property, or a mobile home. All sorts of things. It can be where somebody lives as an adult. But the question at the top of the slide says, do people who rely on others to get them out of bed live alone? And this was the next part of Carly's story. Her mom ended up buying the house next to where Carly grew up. And so Carly moved into her own home. And they had figured out how Carly could communicate at night if she needed help. Basically, when Carly went to bed, she had a TV tray that went over her bed. She had a cell phone. She had her Delta talker there, or whatever her communication device was at the time. They had a routine. If Carly needed help, she could easily contact her mother. They got challenged by the rural fire department about, is that safe? And so this was a very assertive young woman and family who really understood the impact of her disability and how to support her to be safe and be independent. And so they advocated for her, and the fire marshal backed off. And so she lived in her own home. But that wasn't the end of her story. Part of Carly's story was always that she was always looking for boyfriends, and with the goal that she was getting married. And this is her wedding, or her engagement announcement. And she's been married probably over 5 years. And so again, as we're thinking about what those post-school outcomes are for people with significant impact of disabilities, we need to help people think beyond the traditional, this person's going to go to a sheltered environment to work or hang out because we don't think they're capable of working in a group setting where they're only around other people with disabilities and they only hang out with people who are paid to be with them. And so Carly's a great example of, yep, she's pretty clear about what she wanted to do, and her family was pretty creative in how they got her needs met.
Ellen, we have a comment in the chat from Ernie.
Okay.
He said, what does your daughter want to do after she finishes school? She wants to be a vet. That might be an individual student he's talking about, or
okay.
An example. I don't know if Ernie wants to follow up with that.
Sorry, yeah. Well, part of the question I would have is, when you have a younger kid who's, has some significant cognitive disabilities, and then you talk to the parents and, well, my daughter, she wants to be a vet.
Mm-hmm.
And then so you see the conundrum. You don't want to say she can't be a vet because you don't know yet, right?
Exactly.
But then when you move through the curriculum and stuff, and you see that they're not going to be able to probably complete high school because they're not able to with a complete high school with a diploma, within the 21 years of whatever. So, and then in that meantime, while you're trying to maybe push it through to support her and in her academics, you have to almost in a sense ignore the life skills because you don't have time. Do you see my?
Yeah. This is
that. I mean, is there a magic book I can read or something? But that's the question I'm running into myself in my school. But because I understand where we're going, but also I want to create an environment where the student has a chance to be as independent as possible when they leave the school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I think when all of us are asked what we want to do for work when we're younger, we're going to pick things that are familiar to us, and that we know about. And I think frequently, young adults with disabilities hear that that's not a realistic goal, and I think we have to be cautious from stepping into that decision maker role or informer role. Because I also wanted to be a vet when I was younger. And I remember going to talks about what kind of schooling you needed to do to be a vet. And I did a couple work experiences where I would pass out immediately as soon as anything got bloody or there was potential blood involved, and my mother would have to come get me at like 6 a.m. because that's when these work experiences were. And so as I learned more about what that job entailed, I realized that wasn't going to be a good match for me. That doesn't mean that part of my barter duties to get my horse, her chiropractic adjustments every 4 weeks is I do the schedule for a visiting chiropractor vet. My paycheck goes to feed and support my bazillion cats, dogs, and horses. So it was kind of, for me, as I learned more about what the job entailed, I realized there's things I can do with animals, and maybe it's not what I get paid to do. Maybe it's how I use my paycheck instead. But I think that's part of what we need to offer folks with disabilities as well. And maybe she's not the vet. Maybe she, when you realize that, okay, so it requires these academic skills and that doesn't really work for you, but you're telling me that and what I've seen is that you're really good with animals. Mm-hmm. She probably, high likelihood that she's better with like medical treatments than I was. You know, maybe there's tasks she does around a vet clinic, or maybe what she ends up deciding is she'd rather own a animal grooming business or something. But I think that's we follow the interest and the skills.
Yes.
And part of what we do, and I'm going to introduce a concept of customized employment here in a bit, and it helps us think about jobs differently. So instead of being limited by like a job title, we think about what is this young person's or adult's skills and abilities, and what are their ideal conditions for success, and how does that lead us to specific job tasks that then we use to renegotiate a job in an interest area for them.
Yes. Okay.
So, but I think we do have to be cautious. It's not up to us to say something's unrealistic.
Right. Right.
You know, and I think all young people most young people don't have a good handle on what's out there, what's going to make you know, enough money to support them, and what it takes. And I think that's part of transition planning, is exploring, and part of high school for all kids.
Right. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. I love that question. So.
You know, there's more we could talk about, but I'll let you continue.
I think we have more ideas along the way.
Yeah.
So, you know, in thinking about, you know, going to college is different these days. And I saw on the internet, which you can learn lots of information very quickly. You guys have a Think College Wyoming. So do parents know about that? Do students know about that? Another thing that I found one day on Facebook was this story about this model who is somebody who has a label of Down syndrome, and you need to go to her website, because, you know, and think about, like, had she said at her IEP, I want to be a model, and we had, you know, had any of us said, oh, that's not realistic. We don't know whether or not it's realistic. Can we support people to explore what their interest area is, what their skills are, what their conditions for success are, and let's see how it turns out. But this is a great website to go check out. She's a model from Australia. And this is a young man who colleagues of mine worked with. And at some point, they decided that he might want to own his own business. And when you talk about somebody being self-employed, even somebody who's got a significant impact of disability, a label of autism, somebody who needs support in order to work and live, his business, I think the first year, he netted $40,000. So this wasn't a hobby business. This was a real business. And this is a young man who requires support to run the business. But many business owners contract out for accounting. They might contract out for marketing. For Pop and Joe, he, you know, has somebody who works with him as an employee, but part of their duties is to help him with tasks he needs help with. And so this is another young man that I worked with in Montana, and we didn't start with the idea of self-employment. After we went through the process of discovery, getting to know him, what we were looking for were tasks that he could do where he had support for mobility, because some days he was less stable than others. He had a label of, he had vision and hearing impacts as part of his disability. And so we were looking for a place where he could make deliveries. And the reason for that was that he liked being mobile with support. He liked having a familiar route with familiar people, and people loved him. He always, the smile on his face from this picture, like this was his smile. When he was happy and doing what he liked, he was smiling. Otherwise, he was laying on the floor of the classroom when he was really upset, and that's how he communicated both. But he would say hello and goodbye to familiar people, and he really liked bringing them things. this turned into negotiating with a local bakery to deliver things to one of the larger companies in this town. And we came up with self-employment because we couldn't find a business that had a need for what he could do for tasks. So we ended up starting his own business. It was part of his work experience during school. And then once he graduated, he was on a wait list for a couple years for developmental disability services. But once he did get services, that staff supported him in his business a couple days a week. But again, it was all created based on who he was and what worked for him and what didn't work for him. So as we're thinking about transition, we're thinking about what are those at the top right-hand corner of this slide. What are the measurable post-secondary goals? And those are based on an age-appropriate transition assessment. So looking at where the student is now in terms of skills, in terms of interests. And so, maybe it's a job working with animals. Maybe it's not that specific yet when you start transition planning. But we want to give people the opportunity to look at, living where they want to live, even if there's supports involved, and then connecting to the adult agencies or figuring out how to best support that person to live and work independently and be in their community. And then also, if they don't have, if they can't do this skill or demonstrate this skill or activity like is traditionally done, are there alternative ways to perform that activity so that they can still participate? And so when we're talking age-appropriate transition assessments, that's a big requirement under IDEA. And I think I've seen a lot of schools really struggling with what assessments are appropriate for students with a significant impact of disability. And I think this picture really sends a strong message. It's that glass half full or half empty picture. And I think as we're looking at how to assess somebody's capabilities, interests and preferences, support needs, especially for a student with a significant impact of disability, we've got to find the assessment that shows what's in the glass, not what's missing from the glass. And so there's, as you heard initially when I was introduced, I've done a lot of work in customized employment. And it's a strategy that enables us to really get to know an individual and think about what they can do for work and figure out work that's really going to match who they are. And so, as I'm thinking about age-appropriate transition assessments for students with a significant impact of disability, I really like to use the process of discovery. And so this link on this slide it's the address to the Roll Institute Transition Project's training events. And we did a 3-part webinar last year on thinking about how do you figure out interests and abilities, and how do you figure out what to come up with for tasks for work experience for a student with a real significant impact of disabilities. And then just coming up in November, if you go to our website, the training and events, our webinar series is starting again around work experience. And the presenter is going to be a mom of a young woman who's already graduated from high school, but she's a young woman with a significant impact of disability. And the mom talks about how did she figure out what tasks would motivate Alana, and how to think about a rich, full day for her daughter with a significant impact of disability. And those webinars are free and you are welcome to join. But you also have resources in your state. Talking about, if we look at what's the priority for services and where people are going to be served who use federally funded services, thinking about employment first and that philosophy. Wyoming has an employment first initiative. You have I believe it's the governor's council on employment first. And so if schools aren't connected with what's happening in your state around Employment First, and families don't know about this, I would heavily encourage you to take advantage of, what's happening in your community, because I would guess that Wyoming is doing some training around customized employment, and it may be more focused on adults. I don't know that. But what I would do is, if I were working with school systems in Wyoming, I would want to make sure that we were connected with the Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities and Employment First to see what resources are available and how does this translate into transition planning for students with significant impacts of disability. The other asset that you have available in Wyoming, because it's federal, is WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And it was passed in 2014. And basically this reauthorized the Vocational Rehabilitation Act. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Voc Rehab, basically it's a service provider for people with disabilities who need help going to work. And in the past, they didn't frequently work with adults who had a significant impact of disability. WIOA has really changed that, and it's really a big part of the philosophy behind WIOA is that we need to have higher expectations that everybody's going to go to work, and that everybody should have the opportunity to prepare for, obtain, maintain, advance in, or re-enter work, or the technical term is competitive integrated employment. And that instead of just assuming a young person is going to go from school to a sheltered setting where they would be paid sub-minimum wage to perform work tasks, that's not allowed anymore under WIOA. And so students have to apply for Voc Rehab. They need to make use of pre-employment transition services, which I'll explain a little more in a second. They need to have career counseling and referral to supports. So, and those are young adults who are 24 and younger, can't go directly from school into a sheltered setting without first trying out and having some counseling around community employment. So that's a big change. And as they're talking about competitive integrated employment, basically how that's defined is full or part-time work at minimum wage or higher with wages and benefits similar to those people without disabilities are earning in the same integrated work environment. And how you get to competitive integrated employment could include supported employment. So a process where a job potentially is negotiated or carved for you, and there's ongoing supports in case you need those supports to learn and maintain your job. Or customized employment, which is another avenue to access competitive integrated employment. And in customized employment, the tasks and the conditions are all negotiated so that it's a win-win between the job seeker and the employer. And so now every state is having to offer customized employment through Voc Rehab. So there's many more opportunities for support for students with ongoing support needs. So as you're doing transition planning, students who traditionally may not have been referred to Voc Rehab you need to be making use of resources that are available through Voc Rehab. So Susan, do we need to stop for any questions?
No, we don't have any questions at this time.
Okay.
Thank you, Ellen.
Okay, we'll power on then.
Ellen, Dina is going to be moderating as well when I have an appointment, so continue on.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. So what if we followed the employment first philosophy and said, okay, so for every student in Wyoming school receiving special ed, what if we began with the vision that every one of them is going to go to work and that they need to tell us they really don't want to work or that they're independently wealthy and they don't need to work, rather than asking them to demonstrate that they're ready to go to work? Think about how that would change what the school day looked like, what your IEPs looked like when you started talking about transition. That would really change things. I know it would in Montana. But do you think I'm talking about this young woman too? And I would say yes. And this is a picture of a young woman named Kelsey, who I got to learn tons from and working from her in her school, or working with her in her school. And this is a young woman who uses a motorized chair to get around. She was learning how to drive the chair by using a switch that was located like actually through the head array of her wheelchair. And she was pretty good at starting it and stopping it and making it go straight. If it required turning, that was something that she was still working on, and we weren't sure if that was going to be a skill that she'd master or not. How she communicated was that she had a pretty strong yes/no response. So if you asked her yes/no questions and she wanted to say yes, she would lift her left hand. As she fatigued during the day, she may not be able to get her hand up, but she'd look to her left hand to say yes. If she wanted to tell you no, she would either turn her head away from you or she'd purse her lips. She also used a Big Mac that she could reach out with her left hand and press it to say, yes, I'd like that one. And she was also making choices out of a selection of 3 items by listening to the choices, and then she could turn her head to the right to hit the switch that was located on the back of her wheelchair to say, I'd like that one, please. So as the school was doing transition planning, they were saying, we'd really like to offer her some work experience. We're just not really sure what it is she can do. And the school had done a phenomenal job with her age-appropriate transition assessments, really highlighting who she was, what her impact of disability was, how how her disability impacted her medically, how it impacted how alert she was during the day, how she communicated. It was great information. The only part that the only role that I played with the school was helping them translate that information into work tasks. So what we realized was that this is a young woman who really liked people watching. She always wanted to know what was going on. And so if you were talking to her and something was going on behind her, she would do everything that was physically in her power to get her head around to see what was going on behind her. She participated more in activities with people who were fun and animated than people who were too directive or, telling her what to do. And we realized that for her to participate in a work experience, physically, it would have to involve using some piece of technology. And so they had her doing some shredding and some delivery in school. And so as we went out to employers to talk about negotiating a work experience for her, we basically were talking, the conditions were it had to be accessible, the location, so that we could manipulate her chair, support her to manipulate her chair. We were looking for hours that were first thing in the morning, because if she started to have seizures, that would wipe her out for the rest of the day. And they typically would start at around 11 o'clock. So we were looking for earlier. It had to be a place with a restroom that was accessible if she needed personal care. Her stamina was pretty low due to her medical fragility. And so we were looking for a place where she could work for 20 minutes, have a 20-minute break where she'd just tip back in her chair, and then she could work another 20 minutes. Based on her health, we were looking for tasks that they didn't have to be done that day. She could do them, and then if she was out sick for a couple days, she could go back and she could still be doing the tasks. And so we put together a visual resume for her and talked to the local employers, and all of them were interested in this young woman who we talked about. Look, this is somebody that you don't typically get to meet, because typically this is somebody who would be bused into Missoula we live in Florence, Montana, and would be served with other people with disabilities. And this is a young woman who, she's very engaging. She loves to be part of what's going on. These are tasks she can do for you. Would you like to offer a potential neighbor of yours an opportunity to have some work experience? And every employer we went to was open to having her come in and do community work experience. Where we did find a match was at the local health club, where she used her technology, the Big Mac switch, to operate a power stapler and a power hole puncher so that she could staple and hole punch membership applications. And it all had to be done where there was stuff going on. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been intrigued to do it. And by the end of the summer, I ran into the person that was providing her job coaching at the local grocery store, and she said, oh my gosh, she's working up to 2 hours a day now. And remember, when we started, we were looking for something 20 minutes, then a 20-minute break, and another 20 minutes. And the woman said, I think she's bored. I think she's ready for her next job. And so to even think about community employment for somebody with a significant impact of disability, we can't start with what the job is going to be. We have to start with who's the person, where would they be motivated to participate, what are their conditions for success, what are the tasks they can offer, and then where is that a fit? And I think for somebody who's going to need that level of individualization and negotiation to get their paid job, we need to invest that much customization just in work experiences for that individual. Otherwise, we're not really going to be able to see what they can do. So if we start with the assumption that everybody's going to go to work, we also embrace that there's different ways that we're going to define work. There's different ways to earn a living and contribute. And we're going to start with figuring out who the person is, instead of assessing or coming up with a list of all the things they can't do. That never helps me find somebody a job. And so just because you can't compete, meaning you can't go, compete against other applicants for a job opening, or you can't do the whole list of duties that are in this job description, that doesn't mean that you can't work in a community job or that you can't be competitively employed in an integrated setting. What it does mean is that you need a different strategy to be successful getting that job. And so there's many people who can work for minimum wage and above in a job, but it's going to have to be secured through a customized approach. The traditional labor market approach isn't going to get them employed. And that's what customized deployment is all about. And it originated at the Department of Labor, but now Wyoming Voc Rehab, just like Montana Voc Rehab, is having to figure out, what does this service look like? How do we fund it? Who gets access to it? And so as you're thinking about transition planning and how are young adults with significant impact of disability in Wyoming classrooms, are they going to be employed after they exit high school? It's going to be really beneficial to learn about customized employment and how those strategies can be used just in even looking at work experiences as you're doing transition planning and transition services for the students. And it all rolls into what we need to do for age-appropriate transition assessments anyway. Because in order to customize employment, we need to look at what's the person's, what are their strengths? What are their support needs? How does their disability impact them? What are their interest areas? And that helps you think about employment, but everything that you learn about the person can also be translated into how are they going to be, what supports do they need to participate in recreation activities as a young adult, or to live in their own home. I highly recommend the process of discovery, which is the foundation of customized as an age-appropriate transition assessment. So I'm going to pause again for questions. Anything in the chat box, Deanna?
I'm looking here really quickly. I do not see any questions at this time.
Okay.
So we'll keep moving on.
We'll keep moving on. And
This is wonderful, Ellen. Thank you. It's
like I hope I'm not totally overwhelming people. And I've realized once again, I have too many slides that we're probably not going to get all through. So I'm going to whiz through some of them just to hit the highlights. But I think, traditionally, as we're thinking about how to prepare students to work in their community after they exit high school, we think about let's teach them how to interview. Let's teach them how to fill out job applications. Let's teach them how to look for want ads. That's great if the labor market approach to job development is going to work for you. But for the students that I've introduced you to so far, none of them would have gotten jobs through those strategies. For anybody else who's successful using those strategies, go ahead and use them, because that's what we're all familiar with. But for students like Carly and Metalia and Kelsey, instead of those, we're going to need to figure out how do we identify their strengths, their ideal conditions, tasks they can offer employers, and instead, let's work on creating a visual resume for them and helping the family see that, wow, they can make a contribution to an employer, so much so that this employer will recognize that contribution and give them a paycheck. But you're going to have to start with customizing work experiences and, taking that different route to even get, like for Kelsey, to even get a work experience. And so this was her first day of work. And it was interesting. The teacher actually went out on maternity leave the day before her first day of work. So the woman in this picture in the blue jacket is a substitute, which I was thinking, wow, like this must have been a real learning experience for her. The person in the far left is the occupational therapist who was always interested in employment. And so he was along, and they basically begged me to go with them on the first day of work. So I got to take pictures. And so we get there and we're thinking, okay, this is the best match we know of. The employer's excited for her to be there. We get in there, we've got all the technology set up. And so we're like, okay, it's time to hit the switch and turn on the stapler. And we're getting nothing from Kelsey. It was a very long 1 to 2 minutes of us trying to be excited and encourage her to participate in this task. And what's going on in front of her, we're actually in this big room, and it's the room where their aerobics classes and yoga classes were, and there's 2 firemen in front of this giant wall of windows with the physical therapist who is, coaching them through exercises for physical therapy. And this is so entertaining to Kelsey and so distracting that at first she is not game at all to participate in the tasks. And as she gets going, you know, after she kind of adjusts to, okay, they're not going anywhere, I can watch and work at the same time, you know, then she started working. But again, this is like at the end of the summer, like this is the young woman who was doing this for 2 hours at a time. So far beyond our expectations initially when we were starting with, okay, we know she can go for about 20 minutes and then she needs a break. But again, we wouldn't have been able to even figure out how to communicate what she could do to an employer or for an employer, or figure out which employers were a good match unless we'd gotten to know her well enough that we could identify what her conditions for success were. And so that was the 20 minutes on, 20-minute break, 20 minutes on, using technology that could operate anything with an on-off switch or could communicate a message. We actually had a pretty long list of tasks. We probably had 20 different tasks that we could offer to employers based on anything we could think of that technology could do, that she could operate. We knew a preference and interest for her mostly were around people watching and having something fun to do and support people she liked. You know, part of her contributions were, this is a young woman who works as hard as she physically can. She will want to do something for your business. These are the things that she can do based on how her body works. And then we only went to employers who met the conditions where she could make a contribution. And so how customized employment works is that from the employer perspective, we're looking for tasks that aren't getting done, that an employer would like to get done or would increase their bottom line. Or we're looking for tasks that the new employee could do that could be done more cost effectively than they're currently being done. Or there's something that would enhance this business that this employee could do for a task that would, again, benefit their bottom line. And so it's a very different approach to job development. And my guess is that in Wyoming, there's probably some training going on for your agencies that provide job development and employment supports to folks with ongoing support needs, as well as to VR. And so it would really be interesting for some of the school staff who are thinking about work experience and employment to be involved in some of that professional development. As you're thinking about what kind of tasks and work experiences are we putting together for students through transition services. Because, you know, going back to some of the initial comments about parent expectations, if parents can see their son or daughter in a work experience that's well matched to who that child is, that adult child, their expectations that their son or daughter is actually going to work for pay when they graduate, that increases. And also, once a young person starts getting a paycheck, they start wanting a paycheck. And once they start realizing that they do have contributions to make in a business, and they do have skills, and they do have preferences and interests around work, they start telling you that they want to work. So I think it's critical that all young adults get work experience, but especially those with significant impacted disabilities. That's got to be part of what's offered in transition services. Because it just really promotes that expectation that students are going to go to work after school. And it gives them different experiences so they can figure out what they're good at, what they're not good at, things they like or don't like. And so if you have somebody who's saying they want to be a veterinarian, you know, part of transition services and career exploration would be interviewing the vet, spending some time there to see what are all the tasks that have to get done there, and potentially doing a work experience there. And then also, maybe beyond that, what are all the different jobs that work with animals that, you know, you could do different tasks for? And now with Voc Rehab under WIOA, Voc Rehab has to start working with students as early as age 15 or 16. It depends on your state. You'd have to ask your Voc Rehab department or agency what age they start working with students with disabilities. And it's all students. So regardless of the impact of disability, get access to something called pre-employment transition services. And that includes career counseling. It includes counseling for post-secondary education, workplace readiness, self-advocacy, and work experiences. So this doesn't relieve schools of their duties for providing transition services, but it's another resource that's available for schools and students with disabilities. So they can help you with work experiences and some of the career counseling. All right, I got them all right, so moving ahead. And so with Metalia, this is Metalia on the back row in the middle. I'm not sure what play this was, but that was one of her roles there. And so as we were trying to figure out what would be a good first work experience for her, her mom decided that she would take it on and figure it out. And the two of us were like, knocking our heads against the wall. And then we're like, oh, duh. Like, of course it would be the community theater. And so one of her first unpaid work experiences in the community was as an usher at the theater, handing people programs and welcoming them to the theater. And so, her mom negotiated that. All of our communities have nonprofits where you can volunteer, and it's a real typical unpaid experience for everybody in your community. And then there's rules and regulations around unpaid work experiences in for-profits. And one of the handouts is a really good resource so that you don't get in trouble as a school and you don't get the employers in trouble if you're going to do an unpaid experience in a for-profit business. But Metalia went on to have many work experiences. And then her first paid job, actually, I negotiated on an airplane ride one night. And it was just talking to a business owner, and she was like, well, what do you do? And so I was trying to explain, she's like, oh, like that big building where the people who use wheelchairs go. And I was like, well, same people, different strategy. And so I just talked to her about this young woman I worked with who was really good at matching. She had great academic skills. She's very precise about matching letters and numbers. And so I started asking the woman, what's something that doesn't get done at your business? And she said, she had developed, as a realtor, she had developed this side business within her business where people who were buying a new property but hadn't sold their current property needed some property management. And so something that took up time that wasn't a good use of her time as the owner was when the invoices came in for different things that property needed. Basically, she had to, use this computerized program to scroll through, identify the property, type in the amount of the invoice and the vendor, and it was an electronic way to cut checks to pay for whatever service was done for the property. And then at the same time, you'd use a very similar software to go in and balance the checkbook for the property management firm. And so as she described the tasks, I said, it sounds like you need somebody to match numbers and letters and just recognize, or match names. Like if it's from this plumber, then the invoice says this plumber, then you scroll through your list of vendors and you highlight that plumber and click on it to generate that check. And she's like, yeah. So that ended up being Metalia's first paid job. And so I was afraid her mother would freak out. So I said, don't worry about it, Jen. It's just matching numbers and letters. And so she went with me to do the job development call. But it was pretty cool. I was like, wow, my first job was like frying French fries and I totally stunk at it. And Metalia's first job is working for a realtor, basically balancing their $400,000 checkbook or bank account and cutting checks for the vendors, which was pretty cool. But again, she wasn't going to get it by going and applying for the job. So Wyoming, like Montana, Some of your employment experiences are going to look different because you've got a bunch of rural areas, just like we do. And so, maybe it's a self-employment experience. I love to go out and take pictures of different, like unique, I was going to say odd, but unique self-employment opportunities that I see when I'm traveling. But this was a really cool, I thought this was fun in Terlingua, Texas, which is down on the Mexico border. It's right along the Rio Grande River. But this was a self-serve honor system plant business, and everything was grown from local seeds. And I was thinking, wow, that could be it could be like part of a school-based business where people had experience, or it could be a student ended up loving self-employment and this was something they chose to do. I know in Montana, this would probably be a thriving business as we're looking at, replacing native plants and getting rid of noxious weeds in certain areas of Montana. Like this could, this could support you. Or also like Montana, Wyoming probably has lots of different things that you could do with pigeons for pay. But again, we're gonna think about business and work experience different in rural areas. But what do other youth without disabilities do to gain work experience? And maybe it's chores within the family home or business or farm. And if that's not something somebody, due to their impacted disability can't participate in, what's another part that they could? So this is another part to how Carly's story in school ended. But Carly had told us that she always wanted to work at Walmart. And so the school negotiated an unpaid work experience initially for her to work at Walmart. And through that, they learned all the tasks that she could do to offer for pay to the employer. And one of the people on the team said, Walmart never hires people with disabilities. They have an open application night where people go in every Tuesday night and just fill out job applications. And they've never hired anybody from this agency that represents people with disabilities. And so instead of filling out an application, Carly's teacher, her mom, and her paraprofessional all went in to Walmart and they had a list. And they were like, these are all the things Carly could do for your store. She has memorized where everything in your store is, because as soon as she gets a paycheck, she's probably going to be leaving it at your store. And it really makes her uncomfortable seeing things, set back on shelves where they don't belong. She would love to be in charge of go-backs for you. So when people return something and then it needs to be returned to the shelves, she would love to do that. And this is how she physically does things. She uses her right hand and she grasps things between her thumb and the rest of her fingers. So the item can't be wider than 4 inches and it can't be heavier than 10 pounds. If it is, what she'll do is she'll know which department that goes to, and somebody can help her by placing that item on the tray of her wheelchair, and she will navigate her wheelchair to the manager, and using her communication device, she'll ask for help. But her wheelchair raises and lowers because remember, like her transition plan was to have that wheelchair. She now has it. And so she can reach everything on the top shelves all the way down to the bottom shelf. She can't reach the lowest shelves, but again, she can bring that item to the manager. So they were able to describe how Carly could get the work done, what she needed for support, and how she was going to make a contribution. And she was hired, starting at minimum wage, whereas the people who were using the more traditional job development strategy weren't hired. And so again, like even in small rural areas, customized employment can be your avenue. So it's going to click to basically, if we assume that everybody's going to go to work after graduation, how will their day in school look differently? How will their IEP goals change? Will work experience look different for students with significant disabilities? If we use a really customized strategy, then work experience won't be the student with the multiple disabilities sitting in a community employment site watching everybody else work. Instead, they'll be participating in a meaningful way. And then how will our support change? So in summary, we've got to start way earlier than 16. We've got to start in elementary school, in middle school, weaving some sort of thoughts about transition and connections to adult agencies much, much earlier. Our expectations of what students with significant disabilities can do for their adult lives, we've got to have higher expectations. We've got to connect families to long-term supports. And if they don't exist, or there's a long waiting list in your state, like there is in many states, how do we educate families about what else is possible? How else to get supports for that young adult so that they can live where they want to live and work where they want to live? Also, make connections with local voc rehab so that you can tap into what's available under WIOA and pre-employment transition services. Connect with your Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities and your Wyoming Employment First. And then realize that transition takes a village. It's not just going to be up to the special ed teacher to figure this out for a student. You need families, you need neighbors, you need community members, you need businesses. But it is possible, and it can look better than it has in the past. So it barely made it. 4 minutes to spare. And so I'm curious, are there questions? Are there comments? Are there concerns at this point that I can address for you?
So at this time, I don't see anything in the chat, but I'll just open it up for a few minutes and see if anyone does have any questions. You can feel free to post them in the chat or unmute yourself either way. We do have one that says, could you touch on the process of discovery?
Sure. Yeah, and let me define it for you. Basically, discovery it's an alternative to a traditional vocational assessment. And how it differs is that it's a very optimistic approach to getting to know somebody in terms of what they can do for employment. And it involves spending time with them at their home and in environments where the person's most comfortable and where they're most who they are. And you're not evaluating them, but you're getting to know them. So if I'm the person doing discovery, I'm gathering information about what works for them, what they do without being asked to do it. How do they participate as, in their home, in their community? And then that information is basically condensed down into those 5 areas that of the ideal conditions, the contributions, the preferences and interests, the tasks somebody could do for work, could offer an employer, and then finally, who the employers would be. And voc rehab, now that they're funding customized employment, not every state is in the same place yet, but they will be paying for the service of customized employment and will be paying vendors to do discovery. And so there's more, I can send you guys more information on discovery and the process, but usually, so again, I'd start with the person at their home and do a visit and explain what customized is, what discovery is. I'd ask them about their routine because it would give me hints about what other activities I'd want to participate in with them to learn about who they are. I'd also learn about who are the other people in their life that would give me information about who they are. It might be school staff, it might be friends or siblings, it might be a neighbor, it might be a developmental disabilities case manager. Each person's list of people is different. It depends on what's relevant to them. And then I'd also look at what are activities that they do that they're really good at, and I'd want to participate in those activities with them. And then I'd also look at some novel activities. When I'm doing discovery in a school, I may do it throughout, like over the course of a school year, and then use what I learn in discovery to inform that IEP. If I were doing discovery to get a person a job and they wanted a job now, then it would be more of an intense time period. But if you're doing it throughout a school year, I'd say, every time a person like has a work experience, I would use that as a discovery activity. If they're involved in different extracurricular activities, I'd say learn something from there. And also I would want information from the family too. Does that answer your question?
They said yes, thank you.
Okay.
Well, Ellen, I just want to tell you, thank you so much. Your message has been extremely inspiring. You've definitely opened our hearts and minds to the many possibilities that students with complex needs have, much more than I thought of, for sure. So I thank you so much for your time and your expertise today.